Good morning. The Subcommittee on Security will now come to order. I am pleased to welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses today to discuss with the committee the future of the U.S. maritime industry. The United States is a maritime state with over 95,000 miles of shoreline, over half of which come from my home state, the state of Alaska. America's ports, waterways, and river systems support over $4.6 trillion in annual economic activity and almost 650,000 American jobs. It is a hugely important part of our economy, and very important that as the global maritime industry evolves and grows, that federal regulations and oversight evolve in lockstep with that growth. Today we hear from Admiral Karl Schultz, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Mark Buzby, the Maritime Administration Administrator, and the Honorable Michael Khouri, Chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, on how to support this change and growth. The varied missions of each agency contribute to the safety, national security, and economic growth of our nation. Congress has given the Coast Guard a wide range of missions, very wide, as the Admiral certainly knows, from search and rescue, ice breaking, maritime environmental protections to port security, drug interdiction, international crisis response, and readiness to support Department of Defense operations. Admiral, as I mentioned to you yesterday, I happened to catch a episode of The Deadliest Catch on the Discovery Channel a couple nights ago, and it was all about our Coast Guard heroes who do incredible work, not just in Alaska, but all over America and the world. Increasing human activity in the Arctic, violence, terrorism, and drug trafficking in the Caribbean Basin, Central America and Mexico, and overseas contingency operations demand an increased Coast Guard presence at home and increasingly around the globe. These pressures push the limit of the service's fleet as well as its personnel. The extended lapse in appropriations earlier this year only served to exacerbate that pressure. It was unacceptable to me and many members of the Senate that the women and men of the U.S. Coast Guard, a branch of the U.S. military, were left unpaid for the dangerous work they do securing our country, while all the other service members were being paid. I, along with a number of our colleagues, are working on legislation that would protect the Coast Guard should another such lapse occur, and Admiral, we want to work with your team on that. Although not a branch of the military, the Maritime Administration, MARAD, plays a key role in securing our national security. The Maritime Security Program, for example, provides a stipend for 60 U.S. flag vessels which operate commercially during peacetime but are in standby to support U.S. military operations during war or national emergency. Ensuring that the Maritime Security Program is appropriately managed and funded is critical to sustaining both the health of the U.S. domestic maritime industry and to securing the logistics supply line for global military operations. In addition to the MSP, MARAD runs a number of other national security level programs such as the Voluntary Intermodal Sea Lift Agreement, VISA, and the National Defense Reserve Fleet, which includes the Ready Reserve Fleet, just to name a few. These programs and ships they support provide the critical unsung infrastructure that our nation relies upon to sustain both security operations and economic development. Of course, the lifeblood behind those programs are the American merchant mariners that crew U.S. flag fleets. This group of highly trained and specialized seamen are not growing as fast as the previous generation is retiring, which poses a national security challenge to policymakers and the industry. The Federal Maritime Commission, established in 1961, is an independent federal agency responsible for the regulation of ocean-borne international transportation of the United States. The bipartisan committee of 5 commissioners administers U.S. maritime law, monitors the activities of ocean carriers, terminal operators, ports, and others. Since its inception, the FMC has worked to ensure that neither the activities of liner shipping groups nor foreign government laws or regulations impose unfair costs on American exporters or American consumers of imported goods. This subcommittee is committed to work to ensure the success of the missions of each of these important agencies, and adequate resources are needed to ensure that this occurs. With that, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Senator Markey for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and thank you for this great hearing today. Very timely, very important. Thank you, Chairman Wicker, for your leadership on these issues, and our ranking member of the full committee, Senator Cantwell. A vibrant, safe maritime industry is essential for maintaining America's economic excellence and military might for decades to come. And here's why. America's domestic maritime industry supports $154 billion in total economic output and $16 billion in tax revenues every year. It supports nearly 650,000 high-wage, secure jobs, ensures America maintains the capability to mobilize the U.S. military for overseas deployment and build military vessels on American shores. It's a very simple formula. A great domestic maritime industry equals a better prepared, more capable military, and a more competitive, dynamic economy. Massachusetts, the Bay State, has always known this, and we thank each of you who are testifying today for your roles in ensuring that we are today as strong as we have ever been. But maintaining our maritime does not come without challenges. I'm just going to refer to what Chairman Sullivan just spoke of. During the government shutdown earlier this year, over 55,000 Coast Guard members, faithful military members dedicating their lives to protect their homeland, were forced to work without pay. And according to the Coast Guard, only 31% of active duty Coast Guard personnel had enough emergency savings to cover 1 month's worth of expenses. That is not acceptable. That is not sustainable. These funding disruptions harm recruitment, retention, and the Coast Guard's ability to fulfill their mission to ensure our nation's maritime safety, security, and stewardship. And that is something that Senator Sullivan and I agree on, and I support 100% his sentiments that we pass legislation to make sure that it never happens again, that the Coast Guard does not receive their pay when there is a government shutdown. So we have to work together to ensure that that does happen this year. A key part of the mission that you have is interdicting drugs on the high seas. Maritime drug trafficking remains an epidemic, with thousands of metric tons of cocaine and other drugs pouring into our country every single year. While the Coast Guard has become increasingly successful at interdicting these drugs in recent years, they did not meet their performance targets for drug removal last year. Fishermen safety is another critical challenge we must address, as fishing is still the most deadly profession in America. While Congress has empowered the Coast Guard to provide training and research funding for fishermen's safety, the actual distribution of this federal assistance has been problematic, potentially harming the program's life-saving goals. And further, the nation's maritime academies and research harbors support and protect federally owned training vessels, but the harbors may not have the resources needed to modernize their docks to protect and support these floating maritime classrooms, which are essential for preparing the next generation of mariners. So as we hear from the agencies charged to promote the strength of our maritime industry, I look forward to exploring opportunities to ensure members of the Coast Guard are granted the same privileges as the other members of our military, enhance the Coast Guard's drug enforcement efforts, address challenges with allocating federal resources for fishermen, safety training and research, and provide targeted assistance towards the modernization of harbor infrastructure to protect and support federally owned vessels at maritime academies and research harbors. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this very important hearing.
Thank you, Senator Markey. And as he mentioned, we are honored to actually have the chairman of the full Commerce Committee and the ranking member of that committee. So I want to offer both of them an opportunity to make opening statements at this hearing as well. Chairman Wicker.
And I'll speak very briefly because we're here to hear the witnesses. But thank you, Senator Sullivan and Senator Markey. And as the subcommittee chairman says, Senator Cantwell and I held a hearing last month with the full committee, and then it was industry stakeholders. Today it is federal agencies who are supporting maritime safety, security, and competitiveness. So this is a great opportunity for us to expand on our tasks ahead, to discuss agency budget priorities, implementation of provisions enacted in last year's Coast Guard, Maritime Administration, and Federal Maritime Commission reauthorizations, as well as legislative proposals for forthcoming reauthorizations of these agencies. I'm struck by how much consensus there is between the opening statement of the chair and the ranking member, and I will take half a moment to echo what they've said about the Coast Guard and the fact that they absolutely should be treated as other uniformed services are. One would hope we would never have another shutdown, that we've learned our lesson finally, but you never know. Clearly, we are in unison in feeling strongly that it's unacceptable not to treat our Coast Guard service members the same as we do the other services. So, Admiral Schultz, Admiral Buzby, and Mr. Khouri, we're glad to see you, and we welcome you and look forward to your testimony.
Senator Cantwell.
Mr. Chairman, I so appreciate that we have 17 different Coast Guard units across the state of Washington. So definitely want to hear from our witnesses. I'm going to submit my statement for the record.
Great, thank you. Well, we have, as I mentioned, 3 distinguished witnesses for this hearing today. Admiral Schultz, Commandant on the Coast Guard, Admiral Mark Buzby, the Administrator of the Maritime Administration, and the Honorable Michael Khouri, Chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver an opening statement, and a longer written statement will be included in the record if you so desire. Admiral Schultz, we'll begin with you, sir.
Well, good morning, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Markey, Chairman Wicker, and Ranking Member Cantwell from the full committee, members of the committee. It is a privilege and honor to have the opportunity to testify before you today, and I do ask that my written statement be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
First, on behalf of the men and women of the United States Coast Guard, please accept my profound thanks for your unwavering support here on the committee and the subcommittee, including the recently enacted fiscal year 2019 appropriation and the funding that came with the 2018 hurricane supplemental funds. These were meaningful steps towards delivering the ready, relevant, and responsive Coast Guard the nation and the public deserve and expect. Yet our work is not done. If you take just one thing from my testimony this morning, I ask that you remember readiness. We, the United States Coast Guard, must be ready to push our maritime border 1,500 miles away from our shores, ready to preserve the $5.4 trillion in economic activity that flows across our maritime marine transportation system on an annual basis, ready to support the geographic combatant commanders' needs across the globe, ready for the next hurricane season, which is right around the corner, ready to put our cyber authorities to use as we adapt to 21st century threats. Without question, building and sustaining readiness is my absolute top priority. I would say we're at a critical juncture, a tipping point of sorts on that front. After almost a decade of near flatline operations to support funding, Coast Guard readiness is eroding, just like the other armed services. Yet unlike the Department of Defense, the Coast Guard funding is categorized as non-defense discretionary spending, which means we were excluded from the focused effort to rebuild our military. And we continue to find ourselves on the outside looking in when it comes to material operations and support plus-ups. In 2017, the Department of Defense received about a 12% boost in operations and support funds, while the Coast Guard received a 4% increase. Yet the Coast Guard's military contributions are in fact immutable. Every year, we proudly expend over $1 billion on defense-related activities in direct support of the combatant commanders, but the $340 million of defense readiness dollars that we receive has not changed in more than 18 years. As an example of our growing defense portfolio, National Security Cutter Berthoff is supporting the Indo-Pacific Geographic Combatant Commander today in the South China Sea, enforcing U.S. sanctions against North Korea and protecting and advancing U.S. interests throughout the Western Pacific region. Though we strive for relentless resilience to execute homeland security and defense operations, our purchasing power has in fact declined. If we continue to neglect our growing backlog of deferred repairs on our capital assets, including shore infrastructure, we will lose ground in the fight to defend our homeland from evolving threats challenging our nation. Despite these challenges, I am in fact extremely proud of the Coast Guard's contributions. In 2018, as part of the Department's layered security strategy in support of Joint Interagency Task Force South, our surface and aviation assets interdicted 209 metric tons, that's 460,000 pounds of cocaine, more than all other federal agencies combined, and we apprehended more than 600 suspected smugglers. Disrupting transnational criminal organizations at sea, where they are most vulnerable, helps reduce the push factors that are responsible for driving human migration to our southwest land border. As I speak today, National Security Cutter Weishi is patrolling the Eastern Pacific. Our national security cutters have exceeded performance expectations by every metric, and now we must focus on transition from outdated and costly medium endurance cutters to our planned fleet of 25 highly capable offshore patrol cutters. That will in fact be the backbone of our offshore maritime fleet. In the polar regions, your Coast Guard is the sole surface presence to protect our rights and project our sovereignty. As access to the region expands and interest from China and Russia grows, it's in our national interest to be there, to enhance maritime domain awareness and build governance in this economically and geostrategically competitive area. That is why the Coast Guard's poised to release our Arctic Strategy Outlook, a refresh of our Arctic Strategy from 2013, later this month. But in the high latitudes, presence equals influence. 2 weeks ago, our sole heavily operational icebreaker, the Polar Star, returned from its 105-day trip to Antarctic to replenish McMurdo Sound. On that trip, the crew did amazing things to keep that ship operational, from putting divers in the icy waters, to put a patch on the shaft, to fighting a fire in the incinerator space. I am proud of the crew, but I am concerned that we are one major casualty away from having 0 heavy icebreakers in the United States inventory. New icebreakers cannot come fast enough. Thank you for the $675 million appropriated in the 19 appropriation for the first Polar Security Cutter. Finally, I appreciate the administration's support for a number of initiatives that invest in our greatest strength, our people. While modest, they represent tangible investments towards a mission-ready total workforce. For instance, critical investments in our marine inspections workforce and to our cyber operations build on capabilities that facilitate the $5.4 trillion economic activity on our nation's waterways. A dollar invested in the Coast Guard is a dollar well spent. And with your continued support, the Coast Guard will live up to our motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral, and I think there's a strong bipartisan agreement on your point, on a number of your points, but particularly as it relates to the icebreakers, so we're focused on that. Admiral Buzby.
Morning, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Markey, Ranking Member Cantwell, ladies and gentlemen of the subcommittee. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to testify today on the Maritime Administration's contributions to ensuring the safety, security, and competitiveness of our nation. Congress recognized long ago that a robust U.S. merchant marine is critical to national defense and domestic and foreign commerce. Yet today, our nation relies on an aging fleet of U.S. government-owned ships to provide surge sealift capacity in times of conflict or crisis, and a shrinking pool of U.S. flag vessels and qualified American mariners, which are critical to our long-term national and economic security. Specifically, the average age of the government-owned vessels of the Ready Reserve Force, or RRF, which provides our military's initial sealift capacity, is more than 44 years old. For the past year, we have struggled to maintain readiness levels across that fleet. To address these needs, the President's FY 2020 budget for the Department of Defense requests $352 million to maintain the RRF. Long-term, MARAD supports the Navy's surge sealift recapitalization strategy, which includes a combination of targeted service life extensions, acquiring and converting used vessels, and building new vessels in U.S. shipyards. Along with the RRF, the Defense Department relies on privately owned U.S. flagships to deploy and sustain U.S. forces in times of crisis and to carry DoD cargoes in peacetime as well. However, of the approximately 50,000 large ocean-going commercial vessels operating around the world today, only 180 fly the U.S. flag. Of those, only 81 vessels operate exclusively in international trade. This is one reason why the Maritime Security Program, which provides stipends to 60 militarily useful ships we would need in a long-term deployment, is so critical. The President's FY 2020 budget requests the fully authorized amount of $300 million for the Maritime Security Program. Congress also wisely adopted cargo preference and the Jones Act to ensure access to U.S. flag vessels and American mariners. In the case of the Jones Act, it provides an important layer of security by ensuring that vessels navigating U.S. coastal and inland waters operate with U.S. documentation and an American crew. Additionally, it supports the majority of our nation's critical shipbuilding, maintenance, and industrial repair capacity. To supply the ranks of licensed American mariners, we rely on the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point and our 6 state maritime academies, or SMAs. Each year, Kings Point graduates approximately 225 new, highly skilled, entry-level merchant marine officers who, with their unlimited licenses and service commitments, are qualified to crew large ocean-going vessels. The President's FY20 budget requests $81.9 million for the Academy to maintain the highest standards of mariner education and training. The state academies collectively graduate approximately 900 entry-level merchant marine officers annually. Unlike the USMMA, which trains on commercial carriers, the State Maritime Academy cadets receive most of their sea time while sailing aboard MARAD-provided training ships, several of which are at the end of their service lives. We appreciate Congress's recent funding of our training ship replacement program. The President's FY20 budget request of $242.3 million for the state academies includes funding for the 3rd new training vessel and maintenance of the existing training ships. Finally, port infrastructure grants will help our ports meet projected growth in freight volumes and U.S. foreign trade. The nearly $293 million provided for these grants in the FY19 Consolidated Appropriations Act will help improve the safety, efficiency, and reliability of coastal seaports. In addition, the $20 million enacted for Small Shipyard Grant Program and the $7 million for the America's Maritime Highway projects are essential to sustaining our growing maritime industry. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight MARAD's programs that support the safety, security, and competitiveness of our nation. I appreciate this subcommittee's continued support for the U.S. maritime industry, and I look forward to your questions, and I respectfully request that my written testimony be entered into the record, sir.
Without objection, and thank you, Admiral. Chairman Khouri.
Good morning, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Markey, Ranking Member Cantwell, and Senators. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Federal Maritime Commission's fiscal year 2020 funding request. I'm accompanied by 2 of my colleagues today, Commissioners Louis Sola and Daniel Maffei. They joined us in January following their Senate confirmation, and we're glad to have them aboard.
We welcome all the commissioners here. Thank you.
Commissioner Rebecca Dye is meeting today with industry stakeholders on our port demurrage detention investigation that I will touch on in a moment. Last year, the Committee on Commerce was instrumental in passing the Frank Lobiondo Coast Guard Act of 2018. This act broadened the Commission's authority to carry out its mission to protect the shipping public, and we are working to implement the various parts of that legislation. While Congress did not assign to the Commission a national security role, America's economic security does rely on a competitive and efficient ocean transportation system. To carry out that directive, the Commission administers a focused antitrust regime tailored to the ocean liner industry. We continuously monitor cooperative operational agreements filed at the Commission by ocean carriers and marine terminal operators. These collaborative business agreements allow the ocean carriers or the marine terminals to achieve operating efficiencies and cost savings. We closely monitor the agreement parties' business activities together with the broader international ocean shipping marketplace for signs of improper, collusive, or anti-competitive behaviors. We have a comprehensive and ongoing monitoring and compliance system that is constantly evolving to respond to changes in agreements, the industry, and the marketplace. Compared to prior years that witnessed significant changes to the ocean transportation services market, 2018 was a more stable period for the industry. There have not been further consolidations among the top tier of ocean carriers. There remains a surplus of ocean vessel capacity, and the marketplace is highly competitive, suggesting that cargo shippers will continue to benefit from lower freight rates offered by the ocean carriers. One area of uncertainty in the coming year is the International Maritime Organization's mandate for vessels to either burn low sulfur fuel or to install exhaust stack scrubbers to remove the sulfur from higher sulfur bunker fuels. The mandate begins in January 2020. And estimated implementation and industry-wide compliance costs run as high as $15 billion a year. Now, normally ocean carriers will try to pass these added direct costs on to shippers. The Commission is monitoring this issue to ensure that carrier cost recovery efforts do not violate the Shipping Act and harm U.S. exporters and consumers. Commissioner Rebecca Dye is leading an investigation to examine carrier and marine terminal practices in assessing detention and demurrage charges. These are fees cargo shippers pay when a container sits on a terminal beyond allowed free time or a container is not returned to an ocean carrier within an agreed period. Commissioner Dye is in the final phase of this effort and will present her recommendations to the Commission by September. Regarding our budget, the Commission is an agency with a specialized mission requiring a small but highly skilled workforce. We are requesting $28 million to support 128 full-time equivalent personnel in the fiscal year 2020. Slightly more than $24 million of this request goes to salaries and office rent. All other expenses associated with operating the agency, such as information technology, consulting, and outsourced services, travel and supplies, are funded from the remaining roughly $4 million. I am proud of the work that our dedicated FMC staff performs every day and the contribution our agency makes towards ensuring competition and integrity for America's ocean supply chain. We are grateful for the support of this committee and its members, and I look forward to working with each of you. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the FMC and its work, and I respectfully request that the written testimony be submitted to the record. Thank you.
Without objection, thank you, Chairman Khouri. Well, I will begin the questioning by talking a little bit about the issue of shipbuilding. Admiral Buzby, small shipyards, in addition to the big ones throughout the country, like the Catalyst Marine Engineering in Seward, Alaska, or Vigor, Alaska's shipyard in Ketchikan, are a vital part of local communities, but also play an important part for our overall economic and national security. Can you speak about the impact that increased funding has had on the ability of the Small Shipyards Grant Program to meet some of these needs?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your question. That's a great program. It helps many shipyards every year. We have, I think, last year we had $20 million to disperse. We were able to help 29 different small
Is
shipyards.
that enough? Do you look at trying to increase that, or is that the number that you think is appropriate?
Well, we're grateful for whatever the Congress passes to us. I would tell you that
That's usually an easy question.
we have a lot more applications for those grants than we're able to actually support.
Okay. Admiral Schultz, I know that you and I appreciate the great work you're doing for the Coast Guard, and I commend you for it. I think you're doing a fantastic job. I appreciate your visits to Alaska, and I think our state has benefited from those. You know, I know you visited the shipyard in Ketchikan and seen the firsthand the great work that's being done up there. We had a provision in the last year's Coast Guard bill that tried to address this issue that you and I have been working on for quite a while, which is it's a pretty good-sized shipyard that has a huge impact on southeast Alaska. Actually makes financial sense for the Coast Guard to do a lot of its maintenance up there as opposed to sending ships all the way back down to California. There's this regulation, as you know, that we've been looking at that has an unintended consequence on that shipyard. We had language in the Coast Guard bill last year that we thought addressed this. Evidently, I was just recently informed that some of the DHS bureaucrats or whatever didn't see it that way, which is an enormous frustration of mine. You get language put in that members of Congress agreed to and pass, and now we have the bureaucracies coming back and saying, well, maybe it doesn't work. Can I get a commitment from you, and I know I'm going to get it because you've already committed to work with my staff and DHS. I will be hauling into my office who's ever making these decisions saying, really? We changed the law and you're still not good to go with it? To once again put this issue to rest, which makes strategic sense for the Coast Guard, for the cost of maintenance, for your biggest district, District 17, and yet somehow the bureaucracy here in D.C. wants to continue to drag its feet on that. Can I get your commitment on that, Admiral?
Chairman, absolutely. I believe, you know, you're right. We did recently get guidance from the department that says that language did not get us there. You have my commitment to work with your staff on the language. Staying consistent with the small set-aside rules that exist today, I anticipate we will have some work with geographic restriction in this calendar year 19 that the Alaska shipyard should be able to be very competitive, compete for if they solicit. But you have my absolute commitment to continue to work on language, sir, that accomplishes the committee's objectives here.
Thank you. It's just a huge frustration of mine, and more importantly, my constituents. I want to talk about icebreakers and the polar security cutter. You know, I got reports, and I'd like you to please provide more details, that when the Polar Star was out, and I've been on that ship, the men and women on that ship do a great job, but holy cow, that is a really, really old ship. I think it was commissioned in the early 70s, analog technology. Was that fire that was on the ship when it was deployed risky, and how long did that take to put out? And, you know, my view is nobody wearing the uniform of the United States military should be deploying on a ship that's that old and that risky, and yet here we are. Men and women of the Coast Guard are doing a great job in that regard. But can you talk a little bit about that and the urgent need and the risk to life and limb of the members of the Coast Guard who deploy on that ship? Can you talk about that, and how dangerous was that fire that, you know, we had on that ship? I mean, fire on a ship is normally a very, very scary thing.
Chairman, I appreciate the question, and absolutely. First off, the funding that comes in the 19 appropriation to get after procurement of the first Polar Security Cutter is absolutely an exciting time for the Coast Guard. We've been at this for a decade.
And you remember the NDAA has authorization for 6 Polar class.
And based on the high latitude studies of yesteryear, our intention was I've talked about a 6-3-1 strategy, a minimum of 6 icebreakers, 3 that are what we call Polar Security or the heavy breakers, and the 1. And the 1 is imminent. I anticipate an award in the next 30 days, a detailed design and construction for that first polar security cutter, sir. So that is an exciting time, and we intend to build a great ship. Hopefully put that in the water here in the 2023 timeline. That initial ship would essentially be enough capacity to replace the Polar Star. The Polar Star has been in a cycle where essentially she does 100, 130 days downrange deployment to replenish McMurdo Station. As I mentioned in my oral statement, McMurdo is at a critical recapitalization point under their AIMS initiative. It's the Arctic Infrastructure Modernization System. They're really relying on the Star being there to break in the ocean giant, to deliver materials so they can take the internet, the ice station to the next level of sophistication and capacity. The Polar Star had some challenges, sir. We're going to invest $15 million as proposed in this budget. We're trying to do a 4-year, multi-year contract here to keep Star and bridge the gap. I'm confident we can fill that gap. I have to obviously make the decision as the service chief, senior operation commander, can I send men and women safely on the Polar Star to Antarctica every year? So we do all the puts and takes, sir. The fire on any ship, I'm a sailor, that is one of your biggest concerns, one of your highest risks. We fought a fire in the incinerator space for about 90 minutes. The crew donned what we call the self-contained breathing apparatus. This was a serious situation. We had Navy and Coast Guard divers on board with an embarked dive chamber. We put them in water, Arctic water off the ice edge to put a patch on the shaft, while shipmates inside the ship crafted tools in their own machine shops, climbed into 30-degree bilge water and fixed the shaft packing. So it is increasingly challenging. As I stated, the risk is if that one breaker goes down, the nation's left with 0 heavy breakers. So, so we're at an exciting time. This first Polar Security, we're going to get off to the races here with an award here soon, and hopefully ships follow here to build out a United States capability, a capacity for the Arctic regions, the Antarctic region.
We'll tell the men and women who did that heroic work that we thank them. And,
Thank you, Chairman.
we're trying to make it so they don't have to deploy on a ship that's that risky. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. In Massachusetts, we had 2,300 Coast Guard members who were forced to work without pay. It's a lot of people in our state. And their fellow servicemen and women were continuing to receive compensation across the planet. And from my perspective, it had to have an impact on morale and on recruitment. And I just don't think it's right. Again, I'm going to come back to the subject that the Coast Guard is treated any differently than the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy, or the Marines. And again, I look forward to working with Chairman Sullivan on making sure that that never happens again. My question to you, sir, is did the shutdown affect morale? And knowing that many of your personnel were actually overseas at the same time, serving with the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, the other branches. What was the impact of having the Coast Guard be left behind in terms of being compensated?
Well, Ranking Member Markey, thank you for the question. Thank you for the opportunity during the shutdown to come in and speak with you and have a frank conversation about those impacts. Sir, I would say, where we are today, kind of working backwards here, we're about 75–80% reconstituted in terms of our ability. One of the big kind of hallmark dates for us comes up in the beginning of hurricane season on 1 June. We've had a couple of years of high activity, so you'll have a ready Coast Guard to respond to storms. There's some things that are very difficult to recover. We delayed periods where we do maintenance on small boats, sort of depot level maintenance, cutter scheduled dockside and dry dock availability. Some of that moved to the right. You play catch up, but you lose time, and an organization that's struggling on the readiness front, that is not helpful. In terms of our people, I would say a couple things. A, I'm very proud of the men and women of the Coast Guard that stood the watch throughout the shutdown. They stayed focused, along with their DHS colleagues at the border and Secret Service and other places, the department writ large. I think the men and women stood the watch and did what they signed up to do for the nation. Our men and women take an oath, and they honored that oath. In terms of, the morale, I think we saw a couple things. It was tough, but the folks did stay mission focused. Our leadership tried to keep their heads in the game. They knew folks were working on their behalf. Members of the committee, Senator Sullivan taking the Coast Guard issue to the floor, very appreciative of that. They do want to see parity. We are an armed force. I think that's indisputable. It's written in law. We saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff weigh in about the Coast Guard issue and the other service chiefs. in terms of impact on morale, we saw some tremendous outpouring of support from the nation. There are some parts of the nation that didn't understand their Coast Guard. I think it raised our visibility. If there's any silver lining in a very difficult situation, it may be the fact that people across the country, people in your state, were doing remarkable things to support the men and women in uniform, from food pantries. I went, I guess on the offensive with my messaging about the unacceptability of Coast Guard men and women standing in food lines and food pantries, but the tremendous outpouring was absolutely heartwarming. And our families that got in front of cameras, not seeking cameras, but had cameras put in front of them, our families stayed on message, their message, that they just want their spouse to be paid for the job. They're proud Coast Guard men and women, proud families that signed up to serve the nation, and we try to stay out of the politics, we try to stay on task.
Right, and I agree with you. There shouldn't be any politics in this issue. Your personnel should be fully paid, the same as every other branch of the service. And again, you're right there, right with the USS Constitution. Our oldest ship is right there in Boston Harbor, and we're very proud of our maritime history, but we also understand the incredible sacrifice all of the people who have served our country in protecting our coastlines have provided over the years. And let me move to you, if I could, Admiral Buzby. I would love to get to the issue of the maritime vessel funding issue. The T.S. Kennedy was launched in 1967, over 50 years ago. Can you tell us how important it is for us to fully fund a program that ensures that you have the best facilities to train the next generation of personnel?
Thank you for that question, Senator. We are laser focused on ensuring that, that we provide the best possible training facilities for all of our midshipmen at all the state maritime academies and at Kings Point. And the replacement of Kennedy, the 53-year-old Kennedy, and the 57-year-old Empire State at New York Maritime, those are our two top priorities. And in fact, the $600 million that have been appropriated for the NSMV program will go to replace those two ships straight away. And our acquisition strategy is set. We're well along in the process. We expect to actually be awarding contract for the vessel construction manager probably within the next 4 or 5 weeks.
Excellent. That's great news, and I thank you again for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Schultz, as you know, the recent flooding in Nebraska has had a devastating impact on my state. On March 15, 2019, the Coast Guard issued a waterway closure to all vessel traffic on the Missouri River between St. Joe and Omaha. Can you provide an update on the impact of flooding in the Missouri River on vessel traffic, and also, do you have a sense of how long a waterway closure may be necessary along the river?
Senator, thank you for the question. First and foremost, our 8th District Commander, working through our sector commanders, Upper Ohio Valley, Upper and Lower Miss, they have a very key role working with other waterway stakeholders, the Army Corps, the commercial interests, and those are generally negotiated conversations about what are the water levels, what is the currents, and to give you an update, ma'am, I'd like to come back to give you a real snapshot today. I don't have a current snapshot today. The flood levels are unprecedented, and we're watching that closely. I think we're looking at weeks yet before we see the waters receding here to normal levels. So that will remain a very dynamic situation. And our men and women that stand the watch there in the heartland are absolutely focused on balancing, the competing interests of economics and industry with safety. And that we obviously walk a fine line there, but we want to err on the safety side and keep commerce flowing. That's absolutely two sides of the same coin for us, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. If you could get that information.
Yes,
to
ma'am.
us
We'll get you
about
a
Missouri,
current
that'll be
snapshot
great.
as of today here.
Thank you. And Administrator Buzby, you've spoken on several occasions about the need for the Jones Act. And I agree that the Jones Act is critical for the United States defensive needs. Can you describe for the committee what impact the elimination of the Jones Act would have on MARAD's ability to activate a sea lift if called upon by the Department of Defense?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I would say it would have a devastating effect, and not just on MARAD, but on our nation's ability to deploy our forces and then sustain them overseas. Our armed forces move via the Merchant Marine, plain and simple. Without the Jones Act, which not just the vessels, but primarily the mariners that operate Jones Act vessels, we would be dead in the water. We would not be able to take this nation to war.
Thank you very much. Chairman Khouri, I continue to hear from shippers that ports, particularly on the West Coast, are experiencing congestion that results in delays in delivering or picking up containers from terminal facilities. These delays frequently result in charges being assessed on the shippers by the ocean carriers or by the terminals that increase the shipping costs. Can you tell me what, if anything, the Commission is doing or looking at doing to address these concerns?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Well, first, port congestion and resulting container cargo delivery delays are indeed a continuing issue. Congestion delays further result in the demurrage charges that you mentioned to shippers for the container's use of ground space at the marine terminal, and then detention charges by the ocean carrier to the shipper for extra use of the container. Now, there are multiple causes for port congestion that we are seeing today. Recall back for just a minute the fall of 2014 and 2015 in West Coast port congestion. If I may, there was little to hide the fact that labor and management were in the middle of contract discussions, and to be diplomatic, port labor productivity had dropped off substantially. But that is not the cause of today's container port congestion. Without trying to rank or prioritize the contributing factors, the list includes: 1, cargo surges as shippers try to anticipate and move cargo in front of announced tariff increase deadlines. 2, most recently, accelerated shipments in front of the annual Chinese New Year holiday and then their factory closures. 3, larger ships are moving into the U.S. Trans-Pacific routes, resulting in surges of containers arriving at the terminals in L.A., Long Beach, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma. Next, we have a continued problem with chassis availability, in particular, chassis shortages at one terminal, while there may be excess containers in another, and then further disruption when, as an example, an ocean carrier requires its containers to be placed on a particular branded chassis. And last, growing reports and complaints that the appointment systems that were introduced in LA and Long Beach last year are simply not working as advertised. A shipper asked me this week, can the FMC just mandate a master grade chassis pool for all chassis in LA, Long Beach, San Pedro Bay? Well, the answer is no, and I do not mean to suggest that Congress should give us such overreaching authority.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm running out of time. So what are you doing about it?
So all of these issues are being sorted through and addressed by Commissioner Dye's fact-finding investigation. That process has brought together the industry stakeholders that from across the spectrum. They're meeting today, but this is one of a multiple number of meetings. 4 areas have been identified as opportunity for development. 1 is standard and transparent language for detention demurrage. 2 is clear, simple, and accessible billing and dispute resolution processes. 3, standard evidence that would be relevant to resolving these disputes, the billing disputes, and consistent notice to the cargo interest of container availability to pick up at the marine terminals. Her report will be due September of this year, and we will provide you and the committee that report as soon as it's available.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and the ranking member, Senator Markey, for holding this hearing. I feel like the subcommittee is in good hands with 2 stewards of very broad maritime state interests, and I thank my colleague from Nebraska for bringing up this very important freight issue, because I think in the ever-evolving Asian market and the Panamax developments, that we cannot be at a standstill when it comes to moving freight. And the challenges that we face in moving it cost effectively is something that we just continue to need to put time and energy into to get those products throughout the United States into Asian markets. So I'm going to focus my attention, if I could, on Admiral Schultz, and thank you for the Coast Guard. The mission that the Coast Guard must meet is, I think, 11 different areas, and obviously you do it with the most minimal budget, so we appreciate the service of the Coast Guard and you. I could ask about, I like the fact that the Coast Guard is modernizing its workforce, which you mentioned in your opening testimony. Thank you for that. You're on the cutting edge of family leave policy. Would love to talk to you about what we need to do for daycare and housing. And I know that in the Pacific Northwest, we have some creosote issues. So I just want to make sure we pay attention to the infrastructure needs on running the Coast Guard as well. But I'm going to focus my attention on two questions. No surprise, Arctic and icebreakers. And as we continue to fight, and I hear your commitment this morning to upgrading in the budget proposals more resources for an icebreaker fleet. But I still don't know what we need to do, and this is my question. Do we need to do more here in the nation's capital to document the major transformation that the Arctic Passage is going to provide for shippers? And do we have everything we need from the IMO to make that route successful in a coordinated function with what other nations are doing? I have, since there are many Alaskan natives that live in Washington State, I've had the chance to visit with many of the Alaska Native corporations, and it's amazing to me to find that they are being called on by the Russians and the Chinese, and they're making major infrastructure investments in Alaska. I think that's good for Alaska, and that's good for the United States. But it does raise the question, where is the United States in making this infrastructure investment for a North Pole passage of cargo container that is going to be a new opportunity for us in the United States? So do we have all the information necessary to successfully convince our nation of the scale of this investment that's needed? And on the IMO level, do we have that level of investment and understanding with other nations about that route?
Ranking Member Cantwell, thank you for the question. I believe we're in sort of a different paradigm today. I mentioned we're going to roll out an update to our Arctic strategy, our Arctic outlook here at the end of the month. There is a national strategy, Arctic strategy, coming out of the White House in the near future, Department of Defense and Navy strategies. I think we are having the conversations much more so today than in previous years. I think we have influenced the space. What has changed in the Arctic? We talk about a peaceful Arctic, safety, security type focus. We're now having a conversation about a competitive Arctic. You know, China has been up in the Arctic here, 70% of the last 7-8 years with their research vessel, the Shuilong #1 here. And they're up there, obviously potentially doing some research, and they have other interests here. They're paying attention to what we do as a nation here as we field through the Department of Defense 5th-generation fighters in places like Elmendorf. So I think it is a competitive space. I talked in my opening statement about, presence equals influence, and we have to project sovereignty. Today, we're up there with the Healy on a sporadic basis. Healy is our medium or research vessel. She was up there in the fall supporting NOAA, National Science Foundation, Naval Reconnaissance, NRO. But that's science type work. We really just need a more continued presence up there. This first polar security cutter starts the conversation, but as I mentioned, most of that capacity will go to the Antarctic, so the conversation would be on additional fleet.
We're going to look with very vigilant eyes on that competitiveness report, because I personally feel like we should be doing more quickly. And maybe for the record, the 2010 bill required vessel operators to complete a safety and stability training course. And I know that the Coast Guard, I want to know when you're going to begin that rulemaking process. Obviously, the heartbreaking sinking of the Destination is, at least it looks like the incident is requirements for safety may have helped in that situation. So when will we get this rulemaking.
Senator, if I could get back to a specific date, and I don't have that here. Obviously, maritime safety is a primary constant, 228-year mission for the United States Coast Guard. I'd like to get back to you with a firm date on that. I don't have that here.
Okay,
with me
I may
this morning.
submit some further
Yes, ma'am.
questions on the destination and that issue. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you all for being here. Commandant, I'm particularly pleased to welcome a Connecticut native and a graduate of two of our best schools, the Coast Guard Academy and the University of Connecticut. Thank you to the men and women who serve with you in the Coast Guard. I wonder if you could update us as to efforts which we have discussed in the past involving possible discrimination based on either gender or race at the Coast Guard Academy. I know that you have sought to counter and address that problem, and I'd like you, for the record, to update us, because I think that those kinds of failings could have an impact on our national security. Coast Guard is essential to our national security, and I think you agree with me that any kind of discrimination ought to be addressed, thwarted, stopped.
Senator, absolutely. First and foremost, across the United States Coast Guard, including the Academy, we strive to have an environment where it is supportive of people of both genders, of all cultural backgrounds, all experiential backgrounds. We are a better United States Coast Guard when we're a more diverse Coast Guard. That is all about inclusivity. You'll hear me talk incessantly about being a more inclusive Coast Guard, a Coast Guard more representative of the nation we serve. We've had some challenges up there in New London. We had a whistleblower case here recently. We protect whistleblowers in the Coast Guard. The DHS Inspector General sent a report to Secretary Nielsen, who forwarded that to me. We have acted on each and every recommendation in that report. We still have a little bit of ground to close on some training updates to make sure our supervisors are better trained on bullying and harassment type policies, and that'll be wrapped up here in the next month or so, but we take that very seriously. The superintendent is fully committed. We have an Eclipse weekend coming up. It's going on this week. Some of your House colleagues, I believe Congressman Courtney will be attending some of those events up there. So that is, we're looking at our equity. We have an equity mindset at New London to make sure if you're a female cadet, if you're an African-American cadet, Hispanic, Asia-Pacific Islander, you have the same opportunities to excel academically, athletically, through other interests. The environment is embracing all. And sir, that has the enterprise, Coast Guard headquarters commitment, my personal commitment, the superintendent's commitment, and I look forward to changing the narrative around that. I'd like the Academy to be the most inclusive. It is a tremendous institution. We've got to make sure we're working inside the fence line, and we have to work on the narrative and the national perception outside the fence line, sir. But we're 40% female in the Cadet Corps. That is fantastic. If you go up there, cadets, female cadets are in leadership. The regimental commander is currently a female cadet, doing great things, leading the Corps, sir. So you have my full commitment to this situation.
Thank you. And I think you suggested and committed that there would be some kind of town halls or public events that would give you or others in the Coast Guard an opportunity to voice some of the positions that you've just taken.
Senator, we're working here with the local chapters of the NAACP. We've expanded the local relationship here, inviting them into meetings. I sent the Vice Commandant up here a couple of weeks ago to meet with the Faculty Senate individually. He met with a wide cross-section of the faculty. I was up there for the cadet annual leadership address. So we're taking these issues head on. The difficult conversations are the absolute necessary conversations we have, and we will not shy away from those, sir, and we will do this, in as open, transparent fashion as possible.
Thank you. I noticed in your testimony you said that the Coast Guard is, in your words, appropriately positioned in the Department of Homeland Security. We've had some discussion. I don't know whether it's been raised here. I apologize that I had a couple of other committee hearings about the positioning of the Coast Guard, most especially after the issue with payment of the Coast Guard, which I found absolutely abhorrent. It was a disgrace, utterly shameful to deprive the courageous and dedicated men and women of the Coast Guard of pay for a single day, let alone 35 days. So I take it your word that you think that the Coast Guard is appropriately positioned, but I wonder whether there's any value to considering somehow changing the statutes so that that absence of pay never happens again, and so that at least for pay purposes, and maybe in terms of some other organizational issues, the Coast Guard is deemed to be a branch of our armed services, which, as you also note in your testimony, it certainly is.
Senator, thank you for that question, and thank you for your words of support to the men and women of the Coast Guard. The shutdown was tough. I would say this, sir. You know, we, as the 5th Armed Service, only armed service located outside the Department of Defense, do find ourselves in a different position in the federal budget. We are in the discretionary non-defense part of the budget. You know, for the department writ large, speaking as one of 22 components within the department, I would like to see a broadening of the conversation of maybe a security and non-security conversation about the federal budget, because I think that would roll DHS up into the same conversation with DOD, because we are absolutely an essential contributor to national security and homeland security. But those are politics above my head. In terms of our proper placement, I do believe we're appropriately positioned within the Department of Homeland Security. Our missions from border security, drug interdiction, we are a law enforcement agency, so posse comitatus creates some unique challenges were we to sit in DOD. So we're appropriately positioned. The House T&I Committee passed out HR, I think it's 367, Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act. Senator, the chairman, spoke earlier about efforts afoot here in the Senate. I think some safety measure here, legislative safety measure, something in the Defense Authorization Act, Coast Guard Authorization Act that linked us to the other armed services might be the artful way to make sure the 5th and smallest of the armed services today is not left on the sidelines in some type of, obviously none of us want another federal shutdown, but were that to happen and were there be a decision that, you know, the Coast Guard and DHS was outside of a conversation about the other services, there's a linkage there. You know, I'd like to not see this happen to the men and women of the 5th Armed Service in the future, sir.
Well, I appreciate that you are approaching this issue so thoughtfully. You happen to have before you right now 2 members of the Armed Services Committee, and I think we can consult with you on some of your ideas in greater depth. But I really feel there is a difference between the defense function that you perform and a lot of the other law enforcement functions that are the work of the Department of Homeland Security, which may be unrelated to defense or even security. And so I think we need to resolve some of these issues, not only for the sake of the Coast Guard. You may be, as you say, the 5th, the smallest. I don't know whether you're the 5th, you are one of them, but no less important than any of the other armed services. So I think this is an anomalous situation that we need to address. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator, just if I could, and just one, I mentioned in my opening statement, there's a portion of the Coast Guard operating funds that come through defense readiness out of defense program. We're trying to have a conversation within our department and across the river. That number has been static since Senator Stevens upped that back in 2001 for 18 years, no cost of a living adjustment. You're absolutely correct. Our contributions in support of the geographic combatant commanders to defense readiness type missions has swelled from that 340 number of yesteryear 18 years ago to almost $1 billion today. So I think there is a righteous conversation that we would welcome the opportunity to inform.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Admiral, I think that you know, you certainly see the commitment and the interest in a bipartisan way to address this issue, and I think working closely with you and your team, you have our commitment to continue to work that both on the Commerce Committee and the Armed Services Committee, which a number of us actually sit on both of those, as Senator Blumenthal mentioned. I want to ask a bit more of a specific question, Admiral Schultz. Of course, on the issue of safety with regard to our maritime and fishing industry, it's critical. It's one of your most important missions, certainly. There was a regulatory review task force that was set up by the Coast Guard in response to the Presidential Executive Order 13777. And as you know, a large, actually majority portion of America's fishing fleet resides in the Northwest Arctic area off the coast of Alaska. And our fishing industry actually met with the wonderful men and women of the United Fishermen of Alaska, UFA as we call them. I know you've met with them before as well. They sent a list of unnecessary and obsolete regulations to the Coast Guard in 2017. Again, not to cut corners on safety, but things that they thought, being on the front lines, that we could work on to streamline regulations. And they are still waiting a response from the Coast Guard as it relates to this regulatory reform initiative. Can I get your commitment to have a high-level member of the Coast Guard meet with the UFA to discuss these regulatory streamlining requests that they had put forward about 2 years ago?
Chairman, yes, you can.
Thank you. Look forward to following up with you on that. There was an earlier question by Senator Fisher that I want to just throw out to all three of you on the importance of the Jones Act, not only with regard to our economy and national security, but securing our borders, protecting the homeland. I just want to open up to the witnesses on your views on that. Occasionally, and like we have good debates in the Congress, of course, there are attempts to get rid of the Jones Act. One thing that I like to note that a lot of people forget, a lot of other countries, I think certainly China, Korea, have their own version of the Jones Act. I mean, a much more stringent version. So that's something else I'd like you to consider, just in all three of the witnesses, if you can give your sense from your perspective of the wisdom of getting rid of that, particularly as, you know, the Korean shipbuilding industry is not going to say, oh, sure, we'll have this, no problem, anyone can come in, compete. Chinese don't even think about it, right? They run a authoritarian regime, and they're all about taking care of their own shipbuilding industry and their maritime. So what would be the wisdom, national security, economic security, competition globally, of getting rid of the Jones Act, which rears its head on occasion here? You're the experts in our industry, and you cover different areas of it. I'd just like to open it up to any and all of our witnesses. Maybe Admiral Buzby, we'll start with you.
Certainly. Thank you, sir. A topic that I love to speak on passionately about because I believe it's so important to our country.
Misunderstood here, though, a lot of the times, because there are, and again, if you can comment on this international component, it's not like other countries, the Japanese, don't have their own version of this.
There's over 98 other countries that have a form of cabotage law similar to our Jones Act.
98?
98, yes, sir.
Wow, I didn't know it was that many.
A recent study revealed that. I would say there are so many aspects of where the Jones Act impacts our both economic security and national security. I would offer just, one, and that is, the operators of our Jones Act fleet that ply the waters every single day of this nation, inland waters, coastal waters, they are invested in our country. They are our countrymen. They know what normal looks like.
Yeah.
They know when something doesn't look quite right, when it's out of sorts. They will say something if they see something. You cannot say that about a foreign operator in our waters. They have no equity. They have no reason to want to report. Our people ply those waters every day. They make their living there. They're members of our community. If they see something, they will say something. That is a bona fide layer of our national security.
It's a great point. Anyone else? Chairman Khouri.
Thank you. Number one, thank you for the question. Two, I grew up in the U.S. flag fleet inland, as the Admiral knows. I had the opportunity after law school to work in this precise area, worked on trying to put together cabotage trades in, let's try to remember, France, Germany, Venezuela, throughout the Paraguay River system, Indonesia, and last, one of the most interesting, to move coal on the Grand Canal in China. And so I have some hands-on experience in dealing with those cabotage rules with various countries, as mentioned, and they are tough. They are not receptive to foreigners coming into their area. And so I agree with everything that Admiral
Wouldn't that
Buzby
be a bit of a unilateral disarmament if we got rid of our Jones Act?
Well,
Relative
you
to
anticipated
China or
my
anyone
next
else, the
comment
98 other countries?
You anticipated my next point is I never have understood just the simplest fundamental point that with the thousands of miles of U.S. coastline and all of the business that we have here, why would we unilaterally disarm ourselves to all of these? Not trying to make any comment about their seamanship or anything else, but that part never made any sense to me.
Okay. Commandant, any thoughts?
Chairman, I would simply add for nearly a century, the Jones Act has been the law of the nation. We're obviously held to that. I think clearly there's implications for national security, for U.S. shipbuilding capacity and expertise. I think any conversation about revisiting the Jones Act really should look at the national equity, should look at the stakeholders. It needs to be a very considered conversation. It has, in fact, been in place a long time, and I think the Maritime Administrator and the Federal Maritime Commissioner have spoke to the other points, sir.
Great, thank you. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Only about 10% of New England fishermen have been through safety training, yet the fishing safety training program will increase the number of safety training, save lives, save the Coast Guard millions of dollars in search and rescue costs. These programs were first authorized in 2010 and were appropriated money in 2017. The grants are only being allocated for the first time this year. That's the first problem. And last year's Coast Guard Authorization Act decreased the federal share from 75% to 50%, and grant applicants were only notified of this change midway through the grant process this past February. These long delays, sudden changes, loss of federal funding shakes the faith of the grant applicants in the program. Senator Sullivan and I are looking into a legislative fix that needs help in implementing the solution. Would you commit to working with Senator Sullivan and me on fixing this problem and renewing trust in the program?
Ranking Member Markey, absolutely. We have a shared interest, obviously, in safety on the water, particularly in our fishing communities. That's a competitive place for men and women to make a living, and you have my commitment on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Admiral Buzby, I'm working on legislation to create a MARAD program providing federal assistance to harbors for infrastructure improvement. Do you think, Admiral, that direct federal assistance to improve harbor infrastructure of our research and education harbors could help protect these federal vessels and help support the education of our mariners?
Are you speaking to upgrading facilities at the State Maritime Academy?
Yeah, at the academies and where the training ships are, yeah.
Certainly, as the owners of those vessels, especially these new national security multi-mission vessels that we're going to soon be sending to the academies, we're certainly highly interested in making sure they have secure berths for these national assets. So, yes, sir, to the extent that we can ensure that's a good berth, it's very important to us.
Yeah, so, and if I can come back to you, Admiral Schultz, on naloxone and drug addiction and the training that we need to make sure that there is, in fact, a rapid distribution of naloxone and then a knowledge as to how to use it. Could you talk about how that impacts your force that you are protecting?
Yes, sir, Ranking Member Markey. We have fielded Narcan out of our pointy end operational units. So if we encounter someone at sea, it's sort of twofold. A, we want to protect the men and women out there. You know, the fentanyl, these these derivatives of fentanyl, very dangerous. Even if we're walking through a ship, you open a space, the dust can come up and pose a risk to our men and women that are doing frontline law enforcement and rescue work. And B, if we encounter a fisherman or recreational boater in distress, we have the ability to offer some assistance. So we are continually looking at where we should position ourselves as an organization dealing with this national crisis here with the opioids and fentanyl.
Do you think that the Coast Guard should expand the practice of training personnel in terms of the use of this technology?
Sure, we're training our folks that are carrying it currently, but if there's more to that, certainly willing to work with your staff to understand what your intent would be there, sir.
Okay. And I'd love to talk about drug interdiction in general coming into our country. We know that fentanyl largely comes in through Mexico from China. They use our mail system to send it into our country. But we also know that there are huge flows of cocaine that come up from South America, other places, that just exacerbating our epidemic of drug addiction in our country. So, Admiral, can you step back a little bit, give us your overview of this drug problem and the interdiction strategies which you want to implement, and any other resources that you might think that you need, because it is imperative that we just have all hands on deck, so to speak, to fight it.
Ranking Member Markey, thank you for the question. Our work in thwarting illicit drugs that are coming to the United States is predominantly against the cocaine threat. 95% of the cocaine that departs from the Andean Ridge, where all the coca in the world is produced, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, 95% heading north comes out of Colombia. And if you kind of look in the last decade, Colombia was on a track to eradicate more hectares of cocaine every year for many years. As President Santos, President Duque's predecessor, was marching Colombia out of a 52-year insurgency with the FARC, they made decisions, political decisions. They stopped aerial eradicating, spraying coca plants throughout Colombia. Coca cultivation, the FARC derivatives were planting coca everywhere. So there's more coca than there's been ever before grown in coca in Colombia. President Duque, the new administration, is keenly focused on that. I think they've tripled their manual eradication from previous years. There's a clear testament that they are stepping into this. They will not manually eradicate on this. Interdiction is a key part of that. We, the United States Coast Guard, are partnering with the U.S. Southern Command. I'm a force provider to the U.S. Southern Command. When you look at the cocaine threat, 85% of the drugs in the transit zone, that's that region, once it leaves the source country, their territorial waters, where it transits through the oceans until it arrives here, the cocaine is not generally coming directly to the United States. 85% in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, you know, on the left side of the Central American corridor, 15% spread across the Caribbean, from the Western Caribbean to the Eastern Caribbean island chain. The majority of our Coast Guard efforts are in that Eastern Pacific transit zone. I mentioned, I'll roll it up into a sort of a 3-year statistic. In the last 3 years, we've removed 1.4 million pounds of cocaine and brought 1,800 smugglers to the U.S. criminal justice system for prosecution. We have the cycle of success. When we bring those drug smugglers here to the Department of Justice for prosecution, you know, they're getting stiff sentences, but there's some give and take. You know, a 20-year sentence might be reduced to a 13-year sentence. They give some intelligence, it completes the cycle. Yeah. So we have visibility on about 80 to 85% of those drug movements in the Eastern Pacific. We have capacity.
What do you mean by you have visibility of?
So we have intelligence derived from multi-source, human, all different types of intelligence that tells us knowledge on about 85% of those vessel movements. Typically, it's mostly non-commercial, so it's fishing vessels. It's these low-profile vessels as a new smuggling commodity. It's, you know, the Go Fast. It's a multi-engine, smaller type panga, open type boat. We have visibility on those. We have resources to action about 25 or 30% of that. In those cases,
so you're saying you can see
it's a capacity conversation.
95% of what's trying to get into our country that ultimately winds up addicting and killing Americans.
I would say this, Senator, we see about 85% of it from its point of departure.
Okay.
It's not directly coming to the United States. Those drugs destinally make their first stop
Right.
in the Central American corridor or Mexico. Mexico is increasingly the first stop country. We interdict the drugs at sea in large bulk quantities. It's most vulnerable to our interception. We remove the most from the system. My opening statement said we remove more drugs than all other agencies, federal, state, local combined on an annual basis. That's the place to get it. There is a conversation about capacity. There's capable ships, national security cutters, offshore patrol cutters we're building. The Congress and the administration have been very supportive. We need to keep our foot in the gas on the offshore patrol cutter recapitalization effort. Maritime patrol aircraft, Congress continues to support us with additional C-130J aircraft. That's a long-range aircraft. We had funding in both the last couple of years' budgets to field small UAS. We're fielding Scan Eagle, 2 to 4 Scan Eagle units on national security cutters. That's a gap filler. And
But you have more to, even with that, what would your capacity be to be able to?
so there's some studies that say you could have 15 to 17 major cutters or combatants with a law enforcement attachment to really take a bigger bite out of the
And how many do you
conversation.
have?
Sir, I commit to the U.S. Southcom commander and his subordinate commander, Jad of South. I commit 4 ships on a
4.
daily basis. I'm generally staffing somewhere between 6 and 8. So we are going beyond our commitment. We are committed to this Western Hemisphere problem set. I commit multiple airplanes, airborne use of force helicopters. The 20 budget actually allows us to add a 5th airborne use of helicopter to a steady, persistent presence, sir. So we throw just about everything I can at that within other competing demands.
No, I appreciate that. I just, in this modern era, as we fully understand the drug epidemic in our country, the number of people who die every single year. For example, I'm going to go to fentanyl, but 2,000 people, almost 2,000 died last year in Massachusetts, where 2% of America's.
For cocaine, first-time use is up in the last year or two for the first time in many years.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. Cocaine laced with fentanyl is up. It's an epidemic. More people are dying from drug-related violence and overdose than vehicle accidents in the nation. It's a clarion call as a nation.
So we've moved on in Massachusetts from cocaine and heroin and prescription drugs to fentanyl, which is coming in from China.
It's coming, as you said, mail order, one
And then
individual.
through Mexico, yeah.
One individual with a computer is a cartel.
So if people were dying across the whole country at the same rate are dying in Massachusetts, it would be 100,000 people a year. That would be 2 Vietnam Wars every year that would be losing. That's the rate at which they're dying in Massachusetts. There'd be 1 million people over 10 years. And that's just coming through a fentanyl aperture. And again, cocaine is a feeder that gets people set up for ultimately the cocaine being laced with fentanyl, which from the drug dealer's perspective is a much more economical source of revenue for them, because they can make so much more because fentanyl is so inexpensive. So what you're doing is really, from my perspective, from a security perspective, this subcommittee's name, it goes right to the protection of the people in our country. And we appreciate what you do on a daily basis with the Coast Guard. But you're telling us you need more resources if this is the mission. And you're saying that the military itself has to dedicate more resources to this mission to be able to provide an interdiction of these drugs that ultimately then are all intended towards making their way up into the United States of America. So, I want to learn more about kind of the resource gap, that exists, given the fact that you're able to see it as it's beginning its trip up to our country, but ultimately with, unfortunately, limited resources to be able to deal with the actual problem in terms of how it can elude the dragnet that we set up and ultimately make it to our borders. So for me, it's our top issue from a security perspective. Just too many funerals, too many people dying. And if I could just ask, and I apologize to you, Mr. Chairman, if you could just go to your perspective in terms of whether or not the Chinese might start to use our shipping lanes to bring fentanyl into our country as well. The profit is just so high.
Senator and Ranking Member Markey, that's a good question. I mean, what we've seen I've been at this, this counter-narcotics business for 36 years as a Coast Guardsman, and it's a very adaptive adversary. When you squeeze in one part of the supply chain, they morph their behaviors to another. Right now, they're still working through the mail system. My Customs and Border Protection counterparts in DHS are working with the U.S. Mail Service and looking at new technologies and how you can define that. We have a flag officer at JATF West, Joint Interagency Task Force West, that looks at precursor chemicals and how those chemicals are shipped across the oceans, many to Mexico. Some of those chemicals are dual use, so they're used in commercial applications. It's difficult to call them out, but we try to get those large bulk loads of chemicals. There's an international partnership component that goes with this in our efforts with the cocaine task. About 2/3 of the activities in the Eastern Caribbean are enabled with some partner nation contribution. About 1/3 of them, 30–40%, are actually partner nation endgame. We have intelligence. We don't have the capacity.
Yeah.
We can put information
We don't
below a
have
tear
the
line.
we don't have
Yes,
the
sir.
capacity. It's a very important sentence for us to hear.
Yes, sir.
You know, because far many more Americans are going to die from that than
Yes,
any,
sir.
any threat from Kim Jong-un or from any, I won't go down the whole litany, but all the stories that are on front page above the fold, you know, talking about security risk to us pale in comparison to this as a threat to people on the streets of the United States and what we're putting into that fight to try to reduce the jeopardy to those families. So we thank each and every one of you for your service, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. I'm going to end with just 2 additional questions, if that's okay, our witnesses. Admiral Buzby, this is kind of a broader question. You know, we're working on reauthorizing the FAST Act here. There's been some interest in a maritime supply chain title in the next reauthorization bill that would enhance some of MARAD's current authorized programs like the Port Development Program, the Marine Highway Program, and I'd like your views on that. And additionally, there's been a lot, there hasn't been enough attention, and again, this is more kind of Commerce, Armed Services Committee on this issue of the strategic ports and how important they are, not just on the military side, but from the perspective of meeting the needs of the military. I'm sure you're quite familiar with the one strategic port we have in Alaska, which is the Port of Anchorage, which is very strategic, not just for the supplies and economic vitality of the state, but also our very large military footprint in Alaska, which is growing. We're going to have over 100 fifth-generation fighters based in Alaska, F-22s, F-35s, in the next couple years because of our strategic location. So can you comment on that as well? I know there's ongoing litigation. We need to, my view, I haven't been involved in it, we need to resolve that relatively soon here because of the importance of that port to the entire state and to the country's national defense. But can you comment on both of those issues that fall under your purview? The first one on the FAST Act and then on the strategic ports and their importance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we at the Maritime Administration and at the Department, you know, view the shoreside part of the merchant marine equation, obviously with equal interest and importance, because just all the ships sailing around carrying whatever goods they're carrying has to land those goods at some point, and that's where the true intermodalism occurs in our country, is when the ships transfer to rail, to trucks, to maritime highways, and all of that needs to function together, not only in that local area, in that port, but how it plugs into the larger national supply chain. As was pointed out earlier, you know, with the larger ships coming in, with the uptick in maritime traffic that we fully expect to see, our ports need to be modernized. They need to become more efficient, and those connectors are not optimized for these large loads that are starting to come in. When a 22,000 TEU container ship rolls into port and all of a sudden discharges a very large number of containers, you know, that quickly can clog a road network or even a rail network. So to the extent that we can focus on those here going down the road and programs that help us help maritime ports and terminals get more efficient. I think that's an important thing to keep track of. In terms of strategic ports, obviously we pay particular attention to those because they have that military aspect. 17 strategic ports, Anchorage, of course, being one of them. We have to rely on those to move our armed forces. So again, it gets back to that the notion that there's a very distinct commercial aspect to our nation being able to go to war. And it flows through those ports on commercial merchant ships to the front. So that whole part of the equation has to be there and has to be working correctly as well.
Well, thank you. And again, you have a lot of members on this committee that straddle both Armed Services and the Commerce Committee, which I think is important, and for the Coast Guard, but also for MARAD. And like I also mentioned, we're building up the military in Alaska. That port is about 90% of all the imports and supplies for the whole state come through that port. So I know there's ongoing litigation. I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to get to a spot where we can resolve that and then build up that port in a way that secures it, not just on the economic side for my state, but importantly for MARAD and the Armed Services perspective, the military component with the increasing buildup of our military forces, missile defense, F-35s, expeditionary troops, the Coast Guard, we're building up in Alaska in a significant way. My final question, Commandant, I just wanted to mention, and again, you guys do such a great job. Your men and women do heroic work on the search and rescue coverage, but it's a lot to cover. As you know, District 17, I think, is bigger than the rest of the country combined as some enormous area of coverage. We're working together on the recapitalization program to get more assets to Alaska in terms of ships and aircraft. The C-130Js are en route to Kodiak, which is a great addition. But I was informed recently that major cutter hours as well as aircraft hours are down when compared to previous years with regard to coverage of the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. I don't know if that's true. Maybe you have a view on that. Is that a maintenance challenge that's predicating that, if it is true, or is there something else contributing to the reduction of hours in that really important area, particularly as it relates to fisheries and coverage for safety?
Chairman, first and foremost, thanks for your support in the question. We strive from a planning factor to have 1-0 coverage, a ship every calendar day covering down in the Bering Sea. And last year, we fell short on that on 2 days. 6 months into this year here, as we start, the first month of this last 6 months of the year here, we lost about 2 weeks of major cutter coverage when the Monroe went down to 378 high endurance cutter. That's approaching half century in service. We had an unexpected casualty that left her in Dutch Harbor for an extended period. What we try to do is we try to bring a ship from another part of Europe. I think we sent the Stratton up from thousands of miles away to try to cover that gap. So we are absolutely committed to that 1-0 coverage factor, sir.
That's been the traditional coverage.
That's been the tradition, sir, in the last recent years. When we have a gap, we also try to mitigate that with aviation assets to make sure we still have situational awareness. We can respond. We forward deploy to Coal Bay for seasonal type work around the crab season stuff, sir. What we're seeing as we're fielding these fast response cutters, they have the ability where 110 didn't to cross the Gulf of Alaska. So these new ships we're fielding, they will bring, it's 6 fast response cutters that we worked about the 2-on-1-2 plan for
yes,
catch in Kodiak and Seward and Sitka with your support. And sir, you've been carrying the water on that. You and Senator Murkowski were appreciative. We're going to put the 287s there. We'll actually have a significant increase in capacity. The 110s program for 1,800 hours, we're probably getting 1,300 hours. Each FRC is 2,500 hours. Sophisticated command and control, better capability in terms of small boats, stern launch, significantly more tonnage, much more reach, as I alluded to, sir. So I think you're going to see 100 additional bodies that are maintainers, supporters, plus additional crew sizes, 8 extra sailors. There's a lot of goodness in terms of capacity, sir, that's going to work at fisheries that are important to you and safety in Alaska with the Coast Guard. And then the 3rd and 4th of the offshore patrol cutters will be destined to the Kodiak and the Alaska waterfront. Those are going to be 360-foot ships, high tonnage, tremendous ability to, you know, sea base with helicopters. We intend to put Scan Eagle type capability, small UAS on there. So you're going to see a real uptick in Coast Guard capacity in Alaska, sir.
Great. I appreciate it, and look forward to continuing to work on the increase in capacity. And so some of that lack of coverage this year was due to the, and again, these
There was
were
the
very
Douglas Monroe's
unfortunate.
breakdown. It was
Monroe
yes,
breakdown,
sir,
and then
yes, sir.
the
That ship
tragedy
is,
that you.
that ship is increasingly difficult to maintain, sir, just from availability of parts.
Yep.
But we're committed. You know, we have the fleet we have until we have the replacement fleet we're getting.
You certainly have my commitment as chairman of this committee to not only fully support, but help to accelerate the recapitalization of the Coast Guard fleet. So whatever you need, just let us know.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, listen, I want to thank everybody again. It's been a very informative hearing, very important positions all three of you gentlemen have. I think everybody's working hard and doing a good job. These are important oversight hearings for our ability to work with the agencies to understand what your priorities are, what some of our concerns are, and then work together to move forward to address both. So the hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators may submit additional questions for the record. Upon receipt, the witnesses are respectfully requested to submit their answers to the committee as soon as they can. I want to thank the witnesses again for appearing today. This hearing is now adjourned.